Good Shabbos. This week is Parshas Naso, and amongst many of the different subjects dealt with in the portion, there's one section which deals with the laws of a Nazir. And a Nazir is someone who does not drink wine, does not cut his hair, and does not come in contact with death in any sort of way. And the Haftorah that we read is related to that particular section in the Torah, and it's the section in Shoftim in the book of Judges, which deals with Samson, with Shimshon. Now, Samson is a very interesting character, and many of us, and according to many rabbis in the Talmud, depict Samson as a hero. And the question is he a hero? Is he a leader? Or, to be very blunt, was he really selfish? And when you look at the story of Samson, it's important to read the story in its entirety. It covers a few chapters in the book of Judges, but you never see Samson leading any people. You don't see him as a tribal leader. You don't see him as saying we have to fight the enemy. The opening scenes in Samson's story is when he says he sees a woman amongst the Philistines, which are the enemies of the Jewish people, and he tells his parents, I want that woman. And his father and mother first say, you're going to take a woman from the Philistines? Why not take from one of us? And the prophet, the Navi who's writing the story, seems to say that God intended it that way. But the question is, did God intend it that way? Therefore, is it considered something which is meritorious? Or it's just that God used Samson in order to kill as many Philistines who were the enemies of the Jewish people as possible? I tend to read it the second way. Yes, God used them as a tool, but the question is, what was Samson's motivation? And it seems that he saw women and he wanted them. And actually, the rabbis in the Talmud criticized Samson that it says at the end that he was blinded, and it says he followed his eyes, and therefore he was blinded at the end by the enemy, by the Philistines. And we see him as going after these women. He has strength because of his hair, which needs another long discussion as why hair and strength are somehow related. But at the end of the day, his whole sort of motivation and all of his sort of career as a fighter against the Philippines are all involved with the women that he chooses and the fact that he runs away from them. The women decide to try to help the Philistines kill him. It's just one story after another, which has nothing to do with the Jewish people at all. The only time the rest of the Jewish people are really mentioned is when they're upset because the Philistines are out to get Samson, and they feel that he's made problems for the Jewish people where they didn't exist before. So at the end, did he kill many of the enemies of the Jewish people? Yes. But what was his motivation? And at the end of the day, when you read the story, it's kind of clear that his motivation was just selfish. And at the end, when he asks God for his power back, he says, Tomus nafshi and plishtim, let me die together with the Philistines. In other words, he no longer has his eyes. He no longer has the ability to follow his desires. And he says, let me at least die while I'm killing the Philistines. And he kills thousands of Philistines who were in the temple where he was held captive. So the question then is, why is the story in the book of Judges, and why is it written? And when you read the whole book of Shoftim, the book of Judges, you see that whole book is really not necessarily an ideal situation that the Navi is trying to tell us, but rather at the very end of the last lines of the whole book, it says, Bayamim ahem, in those days, Ein Melech b'Yisrael, there was no king amongst the Jewish people. Ish hayasher be'einav yasa. Every man did whatever was correct in his own eyes. In other words, it's a time of anarchy. It's a time when the Jewish people were moving from the leaders of Moshe and Yeshua, Moses and Joshua, and there's a long period of time where there is no central leader. And it's only afterwards in the book of Shmuel, the book of Samuel, where we start to see the rise of Samuel, the prophet, who becomes a leader of the Jewish people, anoints the first king of Israel, Saul, and afterwards the King David. Now, did those people have their faults? Yes. When you read the book of Kings, Samuel and Kings, you see that they had many faults, and they were certainly not the most perfect kings. And what were their motivations? Sometimes they were mixed. But I would like to suggest that at the end of the day, at least part of their leadership was motivated by leading the Jewish people. There's very few leaders that could be completely lishma, for the sake of heaven, completely unselfish, and just only for the sake of the Jewish people and nothing for themselves. That almost never happens, and it still doesn't happen today. Ego always gets mixed up when you have a strong leader, when you have a charismatic leader. But I would suggest that in Samson, you don't see that leadership at all. Some of the other leaders in the book of Judges you do, and each one is a different story and must be understood in its own context. But I think with Samson, what it's trying to show is that, yes, there will be leaders that you will have, whether in the time of the prophets, whether later, or even up until today, which might do good for you, might do good for the nation, might kill many enemies, and might even help the nation prosper. But at the end of the day, when their motivation is purely selfish, we have to be aware of them. And I think that's a lesson that we can learn for today. We look around and just look at this political situation, whether here in Canada, in the United States, or anywhere in the world, in Israel. There are some leaders that are motivated almost purely for the sake of the Jewish people or for their nation. And others, which are the norm, are, I would say, primarily motivated in that way, but also want power. They're also greedy. They also have an ego that they're building up throughout their career. And the question is, at what point does their ego get in the way of their leadership? And you could, without going into details, you could look at Israel today and you could see that happening. That even people who start off with a small ego and maybe a large dose of leadership, sometimes the ego starts to rise and outweigh their leadership or their need to lead the people in a purely unselfish way, and they conflate themselves and their leadership with the nation that they're leading. And I think as Jews or citizens of any country, we have to be aware of those leaders and make sure that, yes, they have a use and God puts them there for a reason. There's a verse that says, Leiv Malachim biyad Hashem, the heart of kings is in the hand of God. But we have to be careful to make sure that at a certain point we realize that that's enough. We have to then look towards leaders who really have the good of the nation, the good of the people in their heart, and as their primary, at least their primary motivation. And hopefully that's a lesson. Again, all you have to do is open up a newspaper, watch the news, and you see this is a constant issue throughout the world. Whether it's in the United States, whether it's in Russia, or whether it's in Israel, these issues constantly come to the surface. And I think we should be aware. As a result, I would say, let's learn the story of Samson as a story to tell us what to be aware of, not necessarily that Samson is the greatest hero. Good Shabbos.